The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Sarah Mitchell finally accepted that she had nowhere else to go. She sat in her car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and an engine that had been making concerning noises for the past 6 months, watching the water cascade down the windows and trying to summon the courage to make a decision that felt impossible. In the back seat, her 6-month-old daughter Emma slept in her car seat, blissfully unaware that their lives had just collapsed around them. Sarah was 32 years old, and until 2 days ago, she had believed that she was living the life she had always wanted. A beautiful home in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. A husband who had seemed devoted to her and to the family they were building together. A career that she had put on hold to focus on motherhood, with plans to return once Emma was old enough for daycare. Everything had seemed perfect, a dream that she had worked her whole life to achieve. And then the dream had shattered. Michael, her husband of 4 years, had come home on Tuesday evening with a look on his face that Sarah had never seen before. Cold, distant, already gone, even though he was standing right in front of her. He had told her, in a voice that showed no emotion, that he was leaving, that he had been having an affair for the past year, that he didn't love her anymore, probably never had, and that he wanted a divorce as quickly and quietly as possible. The words had hit Sarah like physical blows, each one stealing more of her breath, more of her balance, more of her ability to believe that what she was hearing was real. She had tried to speak, to ask questions, to understand how the man she had built her life around could suddenly become a stranger who was destroying everything they had created together. But Michael wasn't interested in explanations. He had packed a bag while Sarah stood frozen in the living room, had gathered his laptop and his important documents, had paused at the door just long enough to tell her that his lawyer would be in touch about the divorce proceedings, and then he had left, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the house like a gunshot. Sarah had spent that night in shock, wandering through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar, picking up objects that no longer meant what they had meant just hours before. Emma had cried, sensing her mother's distress, and Sarah had gone through the motions of feeding and changing and comforting her daughter without really being present, her mind trapped in a loop of disbelief and denial. The next morning had brought more devastation. A call from the bank informing her that Michael had emptied their joint accounts overnight, transferring everything to an account in his name alone. A visit from a locksmith sent by Michael's lawyer who would change the locks on the house and informed Sarah that she had 48 hours to remove her personal belongings before the property would be secured against her entry. And a discovery, while searching for her own financial records, that the house had never been in both their names as she had believed. It was Michael's, purchased before their marriage, never transferred into joint ownership, despite his promises to do so. She had nothing. The money was gone, the house was not hers, the car, technically in Michael's name, could be taken from her at any moment. Her credit cards, all joint accounts that Michael had already canceled, were useless. She had a few $100s in cash that she had been saving for emergencies, some clothes and personal items that she had hastily thrown into garbage bags, and a baby who depended on her for everything. And now she was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store she had chosen because it was open 24 hours and had a well-lit lot where she felt somewhat safe, trying to figure out what to do next. She had called her parents, but they were traveling overseas, their phones going straight to voicemail, their return not scheduled for another 3 weeks. She had called her sister, but Jennifer lived in New York with a family of her own and an apartment that was already too small. Her offer of wire money helpful, but not a solution to Sarah's immediate crisis. She had called friends, former co-workers, anyone she could think of, but at 11 o'clock at night with a baby in tow, no one had been able to offer more than sympathy and suggestions to call again in the morning. The shelter she had called were full, the domestic violence hotlines had waiting lists, the emergency assistance programs required documentation and appointments that couldn't be arranged until business hours resumed. Sarah had fallen through every safety net that was supposed to exist for people in her situation, landing hard on a concrete reality that didn't care about her circumstances or her desperation. She was homeless. She and her baby were homeless, with nowhere to sleep but the back seat of a car that might be repossessed at any moment, in a city that was still learning about the woman she had thought she was married to. That was when she heard the scratching at her car door. Sarah's first instinct was fear. She was a woman alone in a parking lot at night, and the last thing she needed was trouble from someone looking to take advantage of her vulnerability. She reached for her phone, ready to call 911, and turned to look at whatever was making the sound. It was a dog. A German shepherd from the looks of it, though its coat was so dirty and matted that it was hard to tell. The dog was sitting beside her car, one paw raised to the window, looking at her with eyes that seemed to glow in the reflected light of the parking lot lamps. It was thin, clearly undernourished, with the same desperate look that Sarah imagined she was wearing herself. She should have ignored it. She should have started the car and driven away, found another parking lot, avoided the complication of a stray animal when she could barely take care of herself and her daughter. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, she opened the door. The dog didn't rush in or jump up or do any of the things that might have frightened her. It just sat there, looking at her, its tail giving a tentative wag that seemed to ask permission rather than demand attention. Sarah looked at the animal, at the ribs visible beneath its dull coat, at the intelligence in its eyes, and felt something shift inside her. She wasn't the only one who had been abandoned tonight. She wasn't the only one who was hungry and scared and alone in a world that didn't seem to have a place for her. This dog, whoever it had belonged to, whatever had happened to it, understood something about her situation in a way that no human she had called tonight had been able to grasp. "Hey there," she said softly, holding out her hand for the dog to sniff. "Are you lost too?" The dog pressed its nose against her palm, then moved closer, leaning against her leg with a weight that somehow felt more comforting than burdensome. Its body was trembling, she realized, not from cold, but from the same kind of fear and exhaustion that had been coursing through her own veins. "Okay," Sarah heard herself say. "Okay, I guess we're in this together." She didn't know why she did it. She had no food to share, no room in her life for another dependent, no resources to spare for an animal when she couldn't even provide for her own child. But she opened the back door anyway, spread one of her old blankets on the seat beside Emma's car seat, and watched as the dog climbed in and curled up beside the sleeping baby with a gentleness that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. The dog looked at Emma, then at Sarah, and something in its expression seemed to communicate a promise. "I'll watch over her. I'll keep her safe. You don't have to do this alone." She named the dog Shadow because of the way it had appeared out of the darkness, and because it seemed to want nothing more than to stay close to her and Emma, a constant presence at the edge of her vision. The first week was the hardest. Sarah learned to navigate systems she had never known existed, waiting in lines at social services offices, filling out forms that asked for documentation she didn't have, explaining her situation again and again to caseworkers who seemed overwhelmed by the volume of people in need. She learned to budget down to the penny, making her dwindling cash supply last as long as possible, buying only the essentials for Emma, and often going without food herself. Shadow stayed with her through all of it. The dog seemed to understand that they couldn't draw attention, couldn't risk being separated by well-meaning officials who might take a stray to a shelter or call animal control. Shadow was quiet, well-behaved, somehow sensing when to stay hidden in the car and when it was safe to emerge. And at night, when they slept in the Civic's cramped back seat, Shadow curled protectively around Emma's car seat, keeping the baby warm and providing a sense of security that Sarah couldn't have provided on her own. The dog's presence changed things in ways that Sarah hadn't expected. People who might have looked past a homeless woman with a baby stopped to talk when they saw Shadow, their concern for the animal opening doors to conversations that led to information about resources, about options, about possibilities that Sarah wouldn't have discovered on her own. A woman at the food bank told her about a church that provided temporary shelter. A man at the gas station where she sometimes parked told her about a lawyer who helped people in her situation pro bono. A teenager who stopped to pet Shadow gave her the number of a woman's organization that might be able to help. Each connection was small, but together they formed a network that slowly began to support Sarah's weight. She found a shelter that would take her and Emma, and even allow Shadow to stay in a kennel on the property. She found a lawyer who agreed to represent her in the divorce proceedings, who told her that Michael's behavior might actually work in her favor when it came to dividing whatever assets truly existed. She found a support group for women who had been through similar experiences, who understood the particular kind of devastation that came from being betrayed by someone you had trusted completely. And through it all, Shadow was there. The dog had fully recovered from whatever hardship had brought it to that parking lot on the night they met. Its coat grew thick and healthy again. Its ribs disappeared beneath newly developed muscle. Its eyes brightened with the spark of an animal that was cared for and loved. Shadow slept beside Emma's crib at the shelter, guarded Sarah on her walks to and from appointments, provided a reason to smile even when everything else seemed hopeless. The other women at the shelter noticed the bond and commented on it. "That dog is devoted to you," they would say. "He never takes his eyes off you, and that baby. You must have been meant to find each other." Sarah was beginning to believe it. 2 months after the night in the parking lot, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line identified itself as belonging to a man named Robert Chen, an attorney with a firm in San Francisco that specialized in estate law. He was calling, he explained, because his firm had been trying to locate Sarah for several weeks, having finally tracked her down through the shelter's forwarding address that she had filed with the post office. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Sarah said, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed impossible. "I don't know anyone in San Francisco. Are you sure you have the right person?" "You are Sarah Mitchell, formerly Sarah Reynolds, daughter of David and Catherine Reynolds, and goddaughter of Margaret Chen, correct?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Margaret Chen. Aunt Maggie, she had called her as a child, though they weren't actually related. Margaret had been her mother's best friend from college, a constant presence in Sarah's childhood, who had gradually faded from her life as Sarah grew older and moved away. They had exchanged Christmas cards for a while, but even that had stopped when Sarah got married and became absorbed in her new life. She hadn't thought about Aunt Maggie in years, hadn't even known if the woman was still alive. "Yes," Sarah said slowly. "Yes, that's me. But I haven't spoken to Margaret it must be almost 10 years now." "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," Robert Chen said, his voice taking on the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered bad news regularly. "Margaret passed away 2 months ago. She had been ill for some time, but she chose to keep her condition private. She passed peacefully, surrounded by the staff of the hospice where she spent her final weeks." Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her, grief for a woman she had loved in childhood and had allowed to drift away in adulthood. "I'm sorry to hear that. She was a wonderful person. But why are you calling me? I can't imagine she left me anything in her will." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that precedes information that will fundamentally alter someone's understanding of reality. "Mrs. Mitchell, Margaret Chen left her entire estate to you. You are her sole beneficiary, and the estate is valued at just over $5 million. The words didn't make sense. They refused to arrange themselves into a meaning that Sarah's brain could process. $5 million. An inheritance from a woman she had all but forgotten, coming to her now in the depths of her desperation like a miracle that she had done nothing to deserve. "That can't be right," she heard herself say. "Aunt Maggie wasn't wealthy. She was a schoolteacher. She lived in a small apartment. She never seemed to have money for luxuries." "Mrs. Chen was, in fact, quite wealthy," Robert Chen explained.
She inherited a substantial sum from her own family and invested it wisely over the decades. She chose to live simply because that was her preference, not because of any financial necessity, and she left specific instructions that her estate should go to you, with a letter explaining her reasoning that I'm required to deliver in person.
Sarah sank onto the bed in her small room at the shelter, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Shadow, who had been lying on the floor nearby, immediately rose and came to her side, pressing against her leg as if sensing her distress.
"I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered. I don't even know what this is."
"I understand this is overwhelming," the attorney said kindly. "I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss the details and begin the process of transferring the assets. Would you be available to come to San Francisco, or should I arrange to come to you?" Sarah looked around the shelter room, at her meager possessions, at the crib where Emma was sleeping, at Shadow, who was watching her with those intelligent eyes. "I don't have the money to travel right now. I'm in a difficult situation." "I'm aware of your circumstances, Mrs. Mitchell. Margaret asked me to monitor your situation after her death, which is how we found your current address. I'll make all the arrangements for your travel and accommodations. We can schedule the meeting for whenever works best for you." Sarah agreed to meet the following week, then hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence, Shadow still pressed against her side, Emma still sleeping peacefully in her crib. $5 million. An inheritance that would solve every problem she was facing, that would give her and Emma security she had never imagined, that would transform their lives in ways she couldn't even comprehend. And it had come from Aunt Maggie, the woman she had allowed to slip out of her life, who had been watching over her even when Sarah had forgotten she existed. The meeting with Robert Chen took place in a conference room at his firm's offices, with windows that looked out over San Francisco Bay and furniture that probably cost more than everything Sarah had ever owned combined. Emma was in her lap, Shadow was lying at her feet. The firm had agreed to allow the dog after Sarah explained that she couldn't leave him behind, and across the table sat an attorney who was about to explain how a school teacher had accumulated a fortune and why she had chosen to leave it to a goddaughter she hadn't seen in a decade. Robert Chen was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her own father. He had met them at the airport personally, had arranged for a hotel suite that welcomed pets, had shown nothing but warmth and respect for a woman who was clearly struggling despite the fortune that was about to become hers. "Before we discuss the legal details," Robert said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table, "I need to give you this. Margaret wrote it shortly before she died, with instructions that it be delivered to you in person. My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Robert has found you and I have passed on to whatever comes next. I hope you can forgive me for the silence of these past years. I wanted to reach out so many times, but I convinced myself that you had your own life now and didn't need an old woman interfering in it. That was cowardice, not consideration, and I regret it deeply. I have been watching you from a distance, following the news of your life through your mother's updates and later through more unconventional means. I know that you married, though I had concerns about the man you chose that I wish I had voiced. I know that you had a daughter, and I celebrated privately while wishing I could have celebrated with you. And I know, because Robert has kept me informed, that your marriage has ended in betrayal, and that you have found yourself in circumstances that no one deserves. The money I am leaving you is not meant to erase what you have suffered or to compensate for my years of absence. It is simply a gift from someone who loved you from the moment you were born, who was honored to be named your godmother, and who never stopped thinking of you as the daughter I was never able to have. I am told that you have a dog now, a loyal companion who found you in your darkest hour. This does not surprise me. You always had a gift for attracting the creatures who needed you most. Take care of that dog as you would take care of family, because that is what he has become. I love you, Sarah. I have always loved you, and I am sorry that I waited until my death to say it properly."
"Your Aunt Maggie?"
Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, while Robert Chen waited patiently and Shadow pressed closer against her legs. The letter explained so much while leaving so many questions unanswered. How had Aunt Maggie accumulated $5 million? How had she known about Michael's betrayal? And how had she known about Shadow, a dog that Sarah had found just 2 months ago? The $5 million that Sarah was inheriting was actually less than Margaret's peak wealth, much of it having been donated to educational charities over the years.
"As for how she knew about your situation," Robert continued, "Margaret hired a private investigator to keep track of your welfare after she became ill. She wanted to know that you were all right, and she wanted to be prepared to intervene if you ever needed help. When the investigator reported that your husband had abandoned you and that you were living in your car with your baby, Margaret was devastated."
She passed away just a few days later, and some of us believe that the stress of that knowledge contributed to her decline.
Sarah's heart clenched at the thought of Aunt Maggie dying while knowing that her goddaughter was sleeping in a car, unable to do anything to help. She could have reached out. I would have been so grateful to hear from her.
"She considered it," Robert said gently, "but she was very ill by that point, barely able to speak, and she didn't want your last memory of her to be one of sickness and decline. She chose instead to leave you this gift, which she hoped would reach you in time to make a difference." The dog, Robert explained, had been mentioned in the investigators' reports. The man had noted that Sarah had adopted a stray German shepherd that seemed to be providing her with companionship and protection during her difficult circumstances. Margaret had been pleased by this news, had commented that Sarah had always had a way with animals, and had added a codicil to her will, specifying that some funds should be set aside for the dog's care if Sarah chose to keep it.
"There was a trust for Shadow," Robert explained, "a sum that was frankly absurd for a dog's expenses, but that Margaret had insisted upon. She said that any creature who provided comfort to you during your darkest hours deserved to be treated like royalty for the rest of its life."
The legal process of transferring the assets took several weeks, during which Sarah remained in San Francisco, living in the hotel suite that the firm had arranged and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. She spent hours on the phone with her parents, who had finally returned from their travels and were devastated to learn what had happened to their daughter. She spent more hours with the divorce attorney in Portland, who reported that Michael had been shocked to learn about the inheritance and was now trying to claim a portion of it, a claim that the attorney assured her had no legal basis, given the timing and circumstances. And she spent her evenings with Emma and Shadow, the 3 of them curled up on the hotel suite's enormous bed, watching the lights of the city through the window and trying to imagine what their future might look like. The money changed everything, of course. Sarah was able to rent a beautiful apartment while she decided where she wanted to settle permanently. She was able to buy a reliable car, hire an excellent attorney, obtain the best medical care for Emma. She was able to breathe, to sleep, to eat without counting every penny and wondering how long her resources would last. But the money didn't heal the wounds that Michael's betrayal had inflicted. It didn't erase the trauma of those weeks in the car, the fear and desperation and grinding humiliation of being reduced to nothing by someone who had promised to love and protect her. It didn't restore her faith in other people or her confidence in her own judgment. Those wounds remained, requiring time and work and support to heal. Shadow seemed to understand this. The dog who had found her in that parking lot, who had climbed into her car and appointed himself her protector, remained at her side through every stage of her recovery. He slept beside her bed, alerting her gently when the nightmares came, his presence a comfort that money could not provide. He accompanied her on walks through the city, providing a buffer between Sarah and a world that still felt threatening despite her changed circumstances. As the weeks turned to months, Sarah began to think about what she wanted to do with her new resources. Aunt Maggie's letter had suggested helping others who found themselves in circumstances like hers, and the idea had taken root in Sarah's mind, growing into something that felt like purpose. She had learned so much during her weeks of homelessness, had discovered gaps in the safety net that were invisible to those who had never fallen through them. Women fleeing abusive relationships often had nowhere to go, no resources to start over, no support systems to help them rebuild. They fell through cracks that no one seemed to notice, ending up on the streets with their children, vulnerable to predators and circumstances that could destroy whatever hope they had left. Sarah had been one of those women, saved only by the intervention of a godmother she had forgotten and an inheritance she had never expected. Most women in her situation didn't have such miraculous rescues waiting for them. They struggled and suffered and sometimes failed, their children paying the price for the inadequacy of systems that were supposed to protect them. She wanted to change that. She wanted to use Aunt Maggie's gift to create something that would help women like herself, that would provide the safety net that had been missing when she needed it most. The Margaret Chen Foundation was established 9 months after Sarah received her inheritance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing emergency housing, legal assistance, and support services for women and children fleeing domestic abuse and financial abandonment. Sarah named it after her godmother, both to honor the woman who had made it possible and to remind herself every day of the unexpected compassion that could change a life. And at Sarah's insistence, the shelter welcomed pets. This had been controversial during the planning stages. Board members and advisors had pointed out the complications, the liability issues, the additional costs of accommodating animals in a facility designed for humans. But Sarah had been immovable on this point, remembering Shadow, remembering how much his presence had meant during her darkest days, understanding that many women in crisis situations faced an impossible choice between their safety and their beloved pets. "Shadow saved my life," she told the board during the meeting where the pet policy was debated. "Not literally, maybe, but in every way that mattered. He found me when I had nowhere to go and gave me a reason to keep fighting. How many other women are out there choosing to stay in dangerous situations because they can't bear to abandon the animals who love them? How many children are suffering because their mothers won't leave without the family dog?" The argument was persuasive. The shelter opened with a pet-friendly policy that allowed women to bring their animals with them, with resources allocated for veterinary care and pet supplies. It was one of the first such facilities in the country, and it quickly became a model that other organizations sought to replicate. Shadow became the shelter's unofficial mascot, visiting regularly with Sarah, greeting new arrivals with a gentle presence that seemed to communicate understanding and acceptance. The women who came through the shelter's doors, many of them traumatized and terrified, often responded to Shadow before they could respond to the human staff. There was something about the dog's calm demeanor, his patient attention, his obvious devotion to Sarah and Emma that helped them believe that safety and healing were possible. Stories emerged of Shadow's impact, tales that became part of the Foundation's mythology. A woman who had been unable to speak about her abuse finally opened up while sitting with Shadow's head in her lap. A child who had witnessed terrible violence began to recover by caring for the gentle dog who never judged or threatened. A mother who had been contemplating returning to her abuser changed her mind after watching Shadow protect Emma with such fierce devotion, realizing that her own children deserved the same level of protection. Sarah documented these stories, using them in presentations and fundraising appeals, showing the world what a dog could do for people in crisis. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from animal lovers who recognized the power of the human-animal bond. Partnerships formed with veterinary organizations and pet product companies. The Foundation's pet-friendly model spread to other shelters, creating a network of safe spaces where women could escape with their whole families, four-legged members included. Emma grew up surrounded by this work. Her earliest memories filled with the shelter and its residents, with Shadow's constant presence, with a mother who had transformed her own suffering into something that helped others. She learned early about the realities of domestic violence and financial abuse, about the courage it took to leave and the support needed to rebuild. And she learned about the loyalty of dogs, about the way Shadow watched over her with an attention that never wavered, about the bond between humans and animals that could transcend the worst circumstances. The shelter expanded over the years, first to additional facilities in Portland and then to satellite locations in other cities. The foundation's budget grew from the initial seed of Aunt Maggie's gift to millions in annual operating funds, supported by donors who believed in the mission and the model. Sarah hired staff, recruited volunteers, built a board of directors that included survivors, advocates, and business leaders who brought diverse perspectives to the work. Michael had tried to interfere, of course. His attempts to claim a portion of the inheritance had failed, but he had continued to make trouble in the years that followed, demanding visitation rights he had never exercised, filing motions designed to harass and complicate. The divorce had dragged on for years, finally concluding with a settlement that gave him nothing except the debts he had accumulated and the reputation he had earned through his behavior. Sarah had heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael's affair had ended badly, that the woman he had left her for had eventually left him in turn, that his career had suffered from the fallout of his actions. She didn't take satisfaction in his misfortune, couldn't summon the energy for revenge or vindication. She was too busy building something meaningful, too focused on the future to dwell on the past. Shadow aged gracefully, his muzzle turning white, his movements slowing, his capacity for play diminishing, while his capacity for loyalty remained unchanged. Emma adored him with the pure love that children give to the animals who share their lives, learning responsibility through helping to care for him, learning compassion through witnessing his decline. On Shadow's 14th birthday, a milestone that German Shepherds rarely reached, Sarah threw a party at the shelter that had been inspired by his presence. The women and children who were currently in residence gathered to celebrate, along with staff members and volunteers and former residents who returned to honor the dog who had touched so many lives. Sarah spoke at the celebration, sharing the story that most of them already knew. The night in the parking lot when a stray dog had appeared at her car window and changed the course of her life. "I thought I had lost everything," she told the assembled crowd. "I was alone in a car with my baby, with no money, no home, no hope. And then Shadow appeared, out of nowhere, like a message from a universe that I had stopped believing in. He chose me, chose us, and in doing so, he gave me the strength to keep going." She paused, looking at the dog who was lying on a blanket nearby, too old now for the excitement of crowds, but still watching her with those intelligent eyes. Everything that exists today, the foundation, the shelters, the thousands of women and children we've helped, it all started with a dog in a parking lot. Shadow taught me that help could come from unexpected places, that connection could form in moments of crisis, that love didn't care about circumstances or status or any of the things we use to divide ourselves from each other. Emma, now 8 years old, came forward to stand beside her mother, her hand resting on Shadow's head. "This shelter bears Aunt Maggie's name because her gift made it possible, but it exists because of Shadow, because a dog found a woman who needed saving, and because that woman found a purpose in helping others who needed saving too." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking at Shadow, at the dog who had walked into her life on the worst night she had ever experienced and had never left. His tail was wagging, slowly, and his eyes were fixed on her face with an expression that she had learned to read as love. Shadow passed away 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, when the light was soft and the world was still. Sarah was beside him, holding his paw, speaking softly about the years they had shared and the difference he had made. Emma was there too, crying the tears that only children can cry for their first real loss, while Shadow's breathing grew slower and finally stopped. The grief that followed was profound, a loss that echoed through every aspect of Sarah's life.
The house felt empty without Shadow's breathing. The shelter felt incomplete without his visits. The routines that had centered around his care suddenly had gaping holes that nothing could fill. Emma struggled to understand the permanence of death, asking when Shadow would come back, when they would see him again, why he had to leave.
Sarah didn't have easy answers. She didn't believe in platitudes about rainbow bridges or heavenly reunions, preferred honesty about the uncertainty of what came next. But she believed, with a conviction that required no faith, that Shadow had been exactly what she needed at exactly the moment she needed it. Whether that was coincidence or fate or something beyond either, she couldn't say. But she was grateful, deeply and permanently grateful, for the dog who had found her in the darkness. The foundation established a scholarship in Shadow's name, funding support for women who wanted to keep their pets but needed help with veterinary costs, food, and supplies. The Shadow Fund, as it came to be called, helped hundreds of animals stay with the families who loved them, preventing the heartbreak of separation that too many women in crisis faced. Sarah continued her work for decades, watching the foundation grow from a single shelter to a national organization with facilities in dozens of cities. She remarried eventually to a man named David, who had been a volunteer at the shelter and who understood, in ways that few people did, the mission that defined her life. They had a son together, a boy named Robert, after the attorney who had delivered the news that had changed everything, and their blended family grew to include numerous dogs who were adopted with the same open heart that had welcomed Shadow on that rainy night so long ago.
Emma followed in her mother's footsteps, eventually becoming the foundation's executive director, bringing new energy and ideas to an organization that had been shaped by her mother's vision. She gave speeches about Shadow at conferences and fundraising events, telling the story of the dog who had found her mother in a parking lot and helped build something that had touched countless lives. And Sarah, in her later years, would sometimes sit on the porch of the home she had built with David, watching the sunset and thinking about everything that had happened since that night in the parking lot. The betrayal that had seemed like the end of everything. The inheritance that had seemed like a miracle. The foundation that had given her purpose. The family that had grown around her. All of it, every bit of it, traced back to a moment when a stray dog had scratched at her car window and she had opened the door instead of driving away. "Thank you," she would whisper sometimes, speaking to Shadow or to Aunt Maggie or to whatever force had arranged for their paths to cross. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for everything that came after."
And somewhere, perhaps in whatever place waits for dogs who have earned their rest, Shadow was still watching over her, still guarding her, still devoted to the woman he had found in her darkest hour and had never stopped loving. The story of Sarah Mitchell became part of the foundation's identity, told and retold at events and in publications, inspiring others who were facing their own moments of desperation. A woman betrayed and homeless with her baby, a dog who appeared from nowhere, a lawyer who revealed a fortune no one expected, and a life rebuilt from the ashes, transformed into something that helped thousands of others avoid the suffering that had once seemed inescapable. It was a story about money, yes, about the $5 million that had made everything possible, but it was really a story about love, about the unexpected forms it could take, about the connections that could form in moments of crisis. Aunt Maggie's love expressed through a gift that arrived at exactly the right moment. Shadow's love given unconditionally from the first night to the last. And the love that Sarah had found within herself, the capacity to transform her own suffering into something that eased the suffering of others.
That was the real treasure, the one that couldn't be measured in dollars. The knowledge that being broken didn't mean being destroyed. The understanding that help could come from unexpected places. The wisdom that being saved carried with it the responsibility to help save others.
Betrayed and homeless with a baby, Sarah had thought she had lost everything. But in losing everything, she had found the path to a life richer and more meaningful than anything she had imagined.
A lawyer had revealed a $5 million surprise, yes, but the real surprise was everything that came after. The family and the foundation and the countless lives touched by a woman who had been saved by a stray dog in a parking lot.
That was the miracle. That was the story worth telling. That was the legacy of Shadow and Aunt Maggie and a rainy night when everything changed. The foundation continues to operate today, a living testament to what can grow from moments of kindness and connection. Women and children come through its doors every day, fleeing situations that seem hopeless, finding resources and support that help them rebuild. Many of them bring pets, animals who have been their only companions through terrible times, and they find a place that welcomes the whole family.
And somewhere on the walls of every facility, there is a photograph of a German shepherd with intelligent eyes, the dog who started it all. Beneath the photo is a small plaque with words that Sarah chose years ago. He found what was lost and gave it back to the world.
That is his legacy. That is what one dog appearing at one car window on one rainy night made possible. A fortune discovered, a purpose found, and a life rebuilt from the ruins of betrayal into something beautiful and lasting and good.